This is the To Health With That Naturally Healthy in No Time podcast for big health topics taken in small bites. I'm your host, naturopathic Dr. Amy Newsel, and this is Season 1, all about the MTHFR mutation. This week, we are going to talk about the different types of folate. One of them is toxic, we've talked about that already, but this can be an incredibly confusing distinction, made far worse by the fact that supplement companies and nutritional information labels often use the terms folate and folic acid interchangeably. Thanks, regulatory agencies. There are 4 different categories of folates that we'll be talking about. One is natural folate. Another is folic acid, which we talked about at some length last week. Also Fhyllinic acid and 5-MTHF. Let's start with natural folate. Folate is the general name for a group of related substances, all in the category called vitamin B9. They're essential to the human diet because we cannot make them for ourselves, hence the term vitamins. So that's kind of the definition of a vitamin. And they're best found in foods. Great sources include dark leafy greens, lentils, chickpeas, and yeast extracts like Marmite, as well as legumes. Folates are not shelf-stable and cannot be used to fortify other foods because they degrade quickly, so the only sources are natural sources. It's not stable enough to be made into a supplement or a prescription. Folate does need to go through the MTHFR enzyme, that's important for MTHFR folks, to be converted into 5-L-methyltetrahydrofolate, 5-L-MTHF, which is the most active form, and so that might be slow or impaired in MTHFR mutants. The next type is folic acid, which we talked about at great length last week. Folic acid is the crystalline, shelf-stable, entirely man-made form of folate. It functions in the same way folate does, but has to go through an initial enzyme in the liver called dihydrofolate reductase in order to be useful, and this particular dihydrofolate reductase is incredibly slow. Because of this, high doses of folic acid often build up as unmetabolized folic acid in the blood. Folic acid has been shown to be toxic at high doses. We've got a whole post about it, and that was last week's talk. When foods are fortified, they're fortified with folic acid, not natural folate. That's things like bread, pasta, cereal, and baking flour. Folic acid does not absorb well for people with inadequate stomach acid. This is everybody who takes an antacid, heartburn medications, or a prescription for reflux. Folic acid also masks symptoms of B12 deficiency, and so can prevent you from getting treatment that you might need if your B12 is low. This is the most common form in supplements, and there are prescription folic acid forms as well. The third form is something called Fhyllinic acid, and I think this is the least talked about form. Fhyllinic acid is the only shelf-stable form of natural folate. It's naturally occurring in some bacteria and yeasts, although the forms sold as supplements are man-made. Also, there's a prescription form of Fhyllinic acid called leucovorin, which is used to counteract methotrexate and fluorouracil toxicity, as well as in complicated folate deficiency and methanol poisoning. Fhyllinic acid is easier to tolerate for some MTHFR mutants than 5-L-methyltetrahydrofolate, and it does convert to the more active forms like THF and 5-L-MTHF, although it still needs the MTHFR enzyme to do it. Fhyllinic acid leads most easily into DNA base pair production, which is purine synthesis, DNA repair, BH4 pathway, that's your neurotransmitter formation, and also ATP synthesis, which is cellular energy production. That really matters. And then there's our favorite, 5-L-MTHF. This is the most biologically active form of folate. It doesn't have to undergo any conversions in the body to be used. It's found in both supplements and prescriptions. Some of those include Deplin, which is labeled for depression, but occasionally off-label used for weight loss and MTHFR issues, and Serafolin NAC for Alzheimer's dementia, or occasionally in complicated pregnancies, and one called Matanx for diabetic neuropathy. Oddly, none of those are actually intended for MTHFR polymorphisms. Go figure. 5-L-MTHF is well absorbed even when your stomach pH isn't what it should be, like if you're taking the antacids or the prescriptions for reflux or heartburn. 5-L-MTHF also does not mask symptoms of B12 deficiency as readily as other forms do, and so you're able to get appropriate treatment. Also, 5-LMTHF is the only form that's able to cross the blood-brain barrier to increase levels of folate in the cerebrospinal fluid. Crossing the blood-brain barrier is extremely important during pregnancy and fetal development, and in those with severe MTHFR mutations. 5-LMTHF can convert to folinic acid, but does so extremely slowly and in a very difficult and complicated manner, so it's best to take both. This form is best for bypassing the MTHFR enzyme for MTHFR mutants and supporting the methylation of DNA, proteins, lipids, and toxins. And if you happen to be a visual person, there's actually a really great visual diagram of how all of these types of folates interconvert or don't. The key points to remember about the types of folates. Folic acid is the only form that has to use the slow DHF enzyme, and the only one that lingers in the blood as unmetabolized folic acid, which is toxic. Naturally occurring folate from unfortified foods can convert to folinic acid or 5-LMTHF, but the conversion to 5-LMTHF in MTHFR folks can be slow or impaired. Folinic acid can also convert to 5-LMTHF, but it still needs to go through the MTHFR enzyme. 5-LMTHF, which stands for 5-L-methyltetrahydrofolate, is the most active form, but it doesn't convert back to folinic acid very easily. Those of us with the MTHFR mutation do have to be mindful of our type of folate. Natural food sources of folate are great for us, and for many people, it can be enough to eat a diet high in natural folate and avoid foods fortified with folic acid. This means lots of dark green leafy vegetables, pulses like lentils and chickpeas, beans, and yeast extracts like Marmite. We'll talk more about food sources of natural folate next week. Some MTHFR folks will find that they still need a supplement as well, which should be folinic acid or 5-LMTHF, or ideally a combination of both because they can interchange, but they lead to different pathways. Folinic acid, you'll remember, leads most easily into the BH4 pathway for neurotransmitters, and 5-LMTHF does all of your methylation. Next week, we'll do a deep dive into food sources of folate because for everyone with the MTHFR mutation, trying food sources and ramping those up is step 1. Also, avoiding food sources of folic acid. So those are supplemented foods or fortified foods. I am super excited to announce that we have a community for MTHFR folks coming soon that'll be packed full of information, resources, and fellow mutants. Go to healthwiththat.com and sign up for the email list if you want to be the first to know. Thanks for listening.